Good morning, everybody. All right, by a show of hands, raise your hand if you play D&D. That's easy. All right. All right, thank you, everybody. I hope you had a good one. No. All right. All right. Thank you very much. So, by a show of hands, and please keep them up, by a show of hands, raise your hand if you've ever lost hit points in any type of game you've ever played. Okay, keep them up. Raise your hand if you've ever leveled up in any game you've ever played. Keep them up. Yeah, raise your hand if you've ever delved any dungeons in any game you've ever played. Is there anybody with their hands down? I don't think so. Oh, there's one back there looking at you. All right, advance the slide, please. If you said yes to any of those questions, you can put your hands down. You have D&D to thank. Because those concepts are unique and original to Dungeons and Dragons from 1974. If you like any of these games right here, and I happen to know there's a lot of people even in the hall today that contributed to some or all of these games. These games have D&D to thank. These games do not exist, at least not in the form that we know them, without Dungeons and Dragons. So we're going to go ahead and get into introductions. If you could advance the slide, Storm. Oh, back one, please. Thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and start with Kyle. Let's go ahead and introduce ourselves.
I am Kyle Newman. I am a filmmaker and an author who loves collaborating with these two gentlemen. I do like narrative feature films, music videos, and we started off in this expedition to make Art and Arcana, which was our first book together. And that was my first book as an author. And the way we met up was I was a fan of Michael's book, Empire of Imagination. I reached out and I said, why don't we do a bigger book, something that encapsulates the D&D history, everything that I've missed, because I took a 15-year break from playing. And Michael's like, we got to bring on Jon Peterson. And I was like, oh my God, yes. And we just started to form a team. And Michael's brother, Sam Witwer, who's not here, is also part of the team on a lot of our books, doing the writing and the history research. And so, I'm a lifelong D&D fan. And it's a pleasure to be here today talking about the world's greatest role-playing game.
Thank you, Kyle. As Kyle said, I'm Michael Witwer. I'm an author, sort of. I write books about Dungeons and Dragons with some of these gentlemen, and on the side as well. Been playing since I was a little kid, as long as I can remember, actually, with my older brother, Sam Witwer, who, because we happen to have a lot of gamers in the house, you might know Sam. He's the voice and the likeness of the Force Unleashed. Galen Merrick, yes, he's the likeness of Days Gone. He's done a lot of stuff in the game space and in the Star Wars space. You might know him. He's one of our co-authors on most of these books as well. So again, it's been a lifelong hobby of mine. It became a real passion of mine for the history of the game, starting a few years ago when I wrote my first book, Empire of Imagination. That's when I got to know my colleague here, Jon Peterson, and we've collaborated a lot since, so the rest is history. I'll go ahead and turn it over to Jon.
I'm Jon. As the two of them have said, we work together on a lot of stuff, so I'm not going to talk too much about that, but I write kind of crunchy academic histories of conflict simulation games, war games, and role-playing games, mostly with MIT Press, and that includes things like Playing at the World, which is just out in the new 2024 brand spanking new revised edition, books like The Elusive Shift, Game Wizards. You saw that making of original D&D book that Wizards put out for the 50th anniversary. I helped out with that a bit, and various other like academic anthologies and stuff like that.
So in today's session, we promised that we would help you understand how D&D, this really strange, weird game, became mainstream, and then how it became so influential to all of the games that we know and love today. So Kyle, can you tell us a little bit about what is Dungeons and Dragons? We can go quick because it turns out everybody here happens to play.
Well, that's what's most fascinating, because everybody here raised their hand and they said they play, but everybody probably plays a completely different game, a completely different style, a different pace, a different tone, and it steps into various genres. And that's what's so customizable and beautiful about Dungeons & Dragons. But at its core, it is a collaborative, interactive, immersive game. It usually occurs in one room. And over the past 20 years or so, it now happens maybe in multiple rooms, but everyone convenes in one shared space, be it digitally or in the same present space. And what happens there is magic. It's characters, it's chance, and collaboration. And anything goes. And that's what's the magic of D&D. That's what's allowed this game to survive and thrive in a digital age when you consider its analog roots. And so, when you say chance, what is it? Like it's character. So every game is all about character. It's about growth. It's about challenge. And that's what you bring to the table. And I think that's why there's so much reward and longevity in the game, because people see it as a way to look inside themselves, create a character that's maybe something subconscious or active they're dealing with in their real life. And it's more than just a video game where you step into it and someone's programmed these parameters and you think you can go anywhere in an open world, but really someone's built a digital wall. In D&D, you could go anywhere. You could go to another time. You could go to your own house or your own timeline. It's completely magical and open, truly open-ended. And so those loose rules, as loose as they are also something that are so foundational and key. And it's given it an identity, and so many other genres and stories have hung their hat on that. And so that's why I think we're sitting here 50 years later, because so much of what D&D brought to the table was foundational in how we play games and how we interact in games. So, yeah, you can go on forever, but you guys get it. But you know what I mean? Every single game is different, and that's magic.
Thank you, Kyle. So, Jon, why don't you talk us through how this all started?
Yeah, so there's kind of a short version and a long version. You could look at some of the new Playing at the World is actually over 1,000 pages. That's kind of the long version. We'll try to give the short version today. So these two gentlemen you see up on the screen, Gary Gygax on the left and Dave Arneson on the right, were both war gamers, people that did a lot of Napoleonic, naval wargaming, things like that, who happened to meet at a little convention that Gary held in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. It's called the Lake Geneva War Games Convention. Became the Geneva Convention for short, and then became Gen Con. They met there at the second instance of it in 1969 for the first time. They agreed they were going to start collaborating on some game stuff. They were going to do this Napoleonic game called Don't Give Up the Ship. And, well, they did this for a little company eventually called Guide in Games. And the game came out as this little pamphlet that, sold a couple hundred copies, right, in 1972. Like most war games at the time, there wasn't a lot of expectation for mainstream success or sales or things like this. But simultaneously, Gary had begun working a bit on a fantasy wargaming context, largely grounded in Tolkien and Robert E. Howard, in a little pamphlet he did called Chainmail with a fellow named Jeff Perrin. And, some of those rules ended up getting incorporated into a campaign activity that Dave started running up in the Twin Cities that he called the Blackmore Campaign. And ultimately, at the end of 1972, when Gary was planning on doing a new edition of Chainmail, he reached out to Dave and said, hey, looks like you got some new rules for this Blackmore thing. There's something about people going underground through these dungeon mazes. I've never seen a game like that before. Can you send me your rules and maybe we can get together and figure out something to do? So by 1973, they had begun collaborating together on a game that quickly became known as Dungeons and Dragons. Next slide, please. Okay. Oh, nice. Oh, you have the slide advancer now. We no longer need to ask Storm. And yeah, when this was published in 1974, this is what a first print, I believe that is a first print, looks like. They made 1,000 of them. They didn't have an expectation really of selling that much. But it turned out sales were a little slow at first, but by the end of 74, they'd gotten through those 1,000 and needed to order 1,000 more. And those started selling out by the spring of 1975. And they started doing little supplements. In the original game, the one you see published here, there were only 3 classes available. You could be a fighting man, a magic user, or a cleric. Well, the first supplement, which was called Greyhawk after Gary's campaign, that introduced the paladin and the thief class. And the second supplement, Blackmore from Dave Arneson, introduced the monk and the assassin class. So things were kind of gathering momentum. By the end of 75, they were ordering 2,000 copies for this, and then 5,000, and then, this thing was really starting to pick up.
And so things are going better and better for this new experimental game that nobody could quite know what to make of. You have to understand, even the notion of role-playing game, that was a term that didn't exist when this game came out. They didn't know what to call it. But it was this amalgam of different rules that were kind of floating around the game, the tabletop gaming world at the time. And it captured the imagination, suffice it to say, of many, many people across the country, including many young people that were interested in adjacent things like early computers. Well, there's no future in that, right? So anyway, long story short, this game goes better and better. Now, here's the thing. It's not an overnight success, not even close. One reason is because it's so hard to explain what the hell the game is and how it works, right? So you actually have to see the game necessarily to even understand it. We'll get back to that.
Let me go in on just real quick on the computer thing as a digression, because we are doing a computer thing here today. There was this intercollegiate computer network called the Plato system that existed in the early 1970s. It started in the 60s, but by the 70s, it actually had like a GUI on these, and it was amazing, this like orange monitor that you would like be able to play games on. It's supposed to be educational, but of course everybody used it to play games. They made a version of Space War and everything else. We can show by 1975 there was already a graphical dungeon exploration experience that was available on the Plato system. So from the very start, people knew this had a potential to leap into the digital realm.
Excellent context. Thank you, John. So again, this game goes better and better, but again, not overnight success stuff. So as John suggested, they started putting out supplements. They even figured out a more simple version of the game called the basic set that comes out in 1977. Simplifies the game, tries to help it make a little bit more idiot-proof, right? It's a hard game to figure out. And in fact, as Kyle suggested, every implementation of the game across the country was different, which of course was part of the magic of the game, wasn't it? So they start putting out kind of high-quality, full-color books, and they start getting real artists on staff. They start growing a real company, for lack of a better term. This is going well. In fact, so well that by 1979, TSR Hobbies, that's the company that produced Dungeons & Dragons, as you can see, was experiencing kind of exponential growth. Things were going really, really well. But here's the thing. This is not a game you could walk into B. Dalton Books or Walden Books and find. It's not. It's a hobby game. And at this point, it's a very, very successful hobby game. But something happens in 1979. Remember, I promised we're going to figure out how did this game come to the mainstream. Something happens in 1979 that's very special that is stranger than fiction. John?
Yeah, so talk about historical accidents, right, that just fundamentally impact the fate of world culture. There was a young man by the name of James Dallas Egbert III. He was 16 years old. He was a student at Michigan State University East Lansing, and he vanished mysteriously during a summer. They had like a summer semester thing. He had been a freshman, was doing some summer classes, and people kind of wanted to know what happened to him, and it started as a very small story in East Lansing, but they lighted on the notion that he played this bizarre game, and when they see the press about it, they often refer to it as a cult game, that people believe, there was this hypothesis that James Dallas Egbert had gone down into the steam tunnels beneath the university, believing that the game was real and that those steam tunnels were a dungeon, and had started to explore them and had become lost and just unable to differentiate fantasy from reality and was probably dead. And by the time he got to probably dead, suddenly this was on the evening news. So it was a week in early September of 1979, right after the last of those AD&D books, the DMG, came out, where you just could not escape stories about this and this lurid speculation about this weird game. Now, of course, it turned out that this was just incorrect conjecture on the part of investigators, and that, in fact, Egbert had run away to Louisiana for unrelated reasons. And when he discovered this publicity, in fact, just kind of reached out and said, "Hi, I'm here. I'd like to come home now." And but the thing is, those lurid stories, they were great copy, big headline story of it turns out kid was okay and that we were all full of shit. Like that, for whatever reason, was not a headline that any major newspaper or newscaster felt like putting out. And as a consequence, however, things really changed in the game.
I have another question for you. What do young people do? What do kids do when their parents tell them not to do something? They do something. Very good answer. They do something. So, John, what happens after all of this media firestorm that has brought this otherwise esoteric game that nobody knew about, brought it to the front page of New York Times and the San Francisco Chronicle? John, what happens to this little hobby game?
Well, I believe we have a chart for this. Suddenly, inexplicably, sales leapt into the stratosphere. And, you would see these, like, there was this private detective, I wouldn't even say his name because his behavior was so despicable, who really, circulated this conspiracy theory very industrially. He would be pictured holding the Holmes Basic set or holding the books. It's like free advertising for the books, right? And so, yes, everybody bought them. And this was not the only controversy, is an important thing to say, that once the James Dallas Egbert kind of seed had been planted, of course, that led to that amazing Mazes and Monsters After School special with Tom Hanks, which was a recreation, basically, of this story, except it was all true. And this game really does drive you crazy, this Mazes and Monsters game. But yeah, what happened is people bought the game, places banned it. It was banned in a small community in Utah. It was banned in places in California because people believed the content was satanic. I mean, just look at the cover, the player's handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide. There's like little devils with like horns and stuff. And if you're some concerned fundamentalist parent looking there at the DMG at this awful, well, it's an ifrit, but you just think it's a demon, right, that is holding some poor woman and like, what is this game about? Should my kids be playing it? And all that did was make kids want to play it more.
So Kyle, we made mainstream. So it's 1983. What's going on here?
So D&D also starts getting fused with music, heavy metal music, and like they were saying, it gets thrown under the bus. It gets this extra scrutiny. But with all this extra income and all these extra eyes on the game, obviously, like any growing corporate entity would, they go to Hollywood. And Gary Gygax, one of the co-founders, decides to chase the Hollywood dream. At the same time, Hollywood's seeing that these type of stories are working and making inroads into the youth. So we start seeing movies like Beastmaster, Conan, Fire and Ice, Excalibur, Dragon Slayer. So there's a proliferation of fantasy in the media. And Gary's in Hollywood trying to get D&D on the big screen. But he does succeed in getting D&D on the small screen on CBS in the form of the Dungeons & Dragons animated series. And that became one of the most licensed and commercialized iterations of D&D in the public eye. And so what we're seeing here is D&D also getting explored in literature, publishing. There's a real explosion of settings and through the 80s, and we're seeing more and more novels coming out, many of them becoming bestsellers. And so how the game is expressed is also becoming an expanded concept. It's not just a game. And as we see D&D right now, D&D is more than a game, it's a lifestyle. There's D&D everything. There's D&D Christmas ornaments. There's D&D pajamas. You've got the whole thing covered. And so this is the beginnings of that.
I'm actually wearing those D&D pajamas under this. But, but the pinball machine just reminds me, you can go back and find the original, like, Intellivision cartridges. They were licensed for D&D, the Treasure of Tarman and things like that. You begin to see this transmedia approach to the game. So it wasn't just novels, and it was novels and comics and calendars but then a lot of it was computer games. I mean, up to the classic SSI Gold Box games, the Pool of Radiance and its many successors. So yeah, it was mainstream to the currently retro computer crowd as well.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm a big Star Wars fan. I look at Return of the Jedi. Basically, George Lucas put orcs in the movie in the form of Morian guards. You've got the squid head in Return of the Jedi, who's basically a mind flayer. And you're seeing it across all things. Spielberg is putting it in an E.T., and the tradition continues all the way up through Stranger Things. So it's D&D being expressed in other mediums. It's so vital.
Thank you, Kyle. So, okay, D&D's mainstream. We're done, right? We're done. Everything's great. It's all downhill from there for D&D, right? Right? Real quick, before we move on to the exciting conclusion of what we have to say, can it be a quick show of hands? Who here has questions? We want to make sure to leave enough time for questions. That we find to be more fun. So 1, 2, 3. Who do you think has questions? If you even think you might ask a question. Okay, 4, 5. Okay, then we'll make sure to keep on time, not our strength as people. Okay, so D&D, is it mainstream? Well, it's known. This company called TSR is hit $30 million in revenue. That sounds pretty good, especially by 1983 standards. But there's a lot of things wrong with the company. We're not going to get into all of the ways this company started to fall apart. But one thing that, well, okay.
I think that's important.
One thing that, of course, starts to happen when people start a company with a lot of passion but not a lot of business savvy, what happens? Well, I mean, we've seen this movie before in many, many respects. Things don't get managed the right way. And I think that's what we're talking about here. Going back to what John talked about, we're talking about some individuals who are extremely passionate about gaming, but these were small-town people that did not have a lot of business experience. They may have even had good business savvy, but one thing that happened with the game, but we certainly do not have time to talk about today, is there were some deals made very early in the game to fund it, to literally make it happen. And those deals ended out, I'm not going to say backfiring, it's just they didn't go well for some of the creators and some of the chiefs of the organization as the game kind of got bigger and stronger. They ran into a lot of credit problems. And basically by 1985, Gary Gygax, kind of the main driver of the game that John talked about earlier, was ousted from his own company. due to tremendous financial problems and a lot of other things that I think business savvy people might describe as mismanagement of the company among him and a lot of his associates. They grew too big, they grew too fast, they were too ambitious. So that leads us into the next, 20 plus years of ups and downs, what some people call the edition wars. So the best way to make money on an existing IP, well, I don't know if it's the best way, but it's one way, roll out a new edition. It's always a great way to get people to buy the new game, to buy the new books, and so forth.
By the way, do we have a new edition of Art and Arcana coming out?
We do.
We do. See, this is validation.
Guilty as charged.
It's a 50th anniversary edition with lots of new stuff in it, and that's coming November 5th.
24 pages of new content. Not that we're selling that, but here we are. So
that's what, 0.1% new content? Yeah.
Well, yeah, it's a big book.
Yeah.
It's a big book. So we get into this edition wars. Some of you might have heard it under a different term, but what ends up happening is that year over year, Gary is gone by 1985. A lot of the original people are gone. That first 10 years basically has passed, and the company's turned over almost in its entirety. What starts happening from there? They get into new editions and lots of new ideas, by the way, a lot of really good ideas. Second edition, maybe many of you in this room started on second edition. There was a lot of wonderful things about it. Again, I'm not here to say the merits or any weaknesses of any particular edition. But what happens year over year is the company kind of continues. It has continued missteps on the management and the business side. So for about 10 years, the company has mostly success and a lot of strong decisions. But about 10 years later, the company again finds itself in a real financial pickle. John, you want to talk really quickly about kind of what was happening around that time?
Well, I mean, in 1997, obviously, there were a lot of competing role-playing games out there in the marketplace. There was certainly digital entertainment. I mean, if you look at a game like Baldur's Gate, which came out around that time, the original Baldur's Gate, it sold 10 times as many copies as a player's handbook was then, right? The shift had just gone in that direction. And this got to a point where, the business at TSR simply wasn't sustainable. Dragon magazine, their legendary flagship, had to stop publishing. They owed money to creditors. There's a great book about this by my friend Ben Riggs. It's called Slaying the Dragon. It goes into a lot of detail about exactly how things went as badly as they did. But by 1997, they needed to sell, basically. And there was this company that made these little collectible cards that were from this card game that was called Magic the Gathering.
Never heard of it.
And a lot of gamer dollars actually kind of been diverted from D&D to that. Well, it turned out they were in a pretty good position to acquire TSR, and so they did after a little bit of kind of shenanigans. But they were then doing so phenomenally well because of another card game that they had fallen into their lap called Pokemon.
Never heard of it.
That they became an acquisition target for Hasbro, who then took over D&D and TSR and Wizards of the Coast.
And fortunately for D&D in this case, right, that's the survivor here, is the actual brand of Dungeons & Dragons. And prior to that acquisition to Hasbro, Peter Atkinson, who owned Wizards of the Coast at the time, loved the game. He was nuts about D&D. In fact, all of the people that were originally the creators and a lot of the early players of Magic were nuts about D&D. So there was a lot of love for that game, and they created a third edition. That was a very, very popular edition. They really modernized the game in many, many ways, turned many things on its head from some of the early, really esoteric designs of the game. But of course, like any time, it was the right game for the right time. Goes well for a few years, but what do you know? In another 5, 6, 7, 8 years, we're starting to see a lot of pressures from the digital space, the MMO space. Why? Because MMOs, of course, took D&D's idea, but they rolled it out on a much larger platform, one that was exponentially larger than anything D&D had ever touched. So by 2008, D&D rolls out, I should say Hasbro now, under Hasbro, rolls out a new edition called the 4th edition of the game.
How many people here have played 4th edition? There we go. So, it's one of those prominent criticisms of the game is that 4th edition tried to emulate aspects of what it was competing with, which were video games. It feels like very video game powers. And so D&D lost a little bit of its identity, maybe in chasing the marketplace rather than staying true to what it is. And so that's one of the challenges with 4th edition. And also what was going on then was, a decrease in sales and questions about, can this game still make a mark in the marketplace? Is it still relevant? Do we have an audience? Is it growing? And the numbers were low. And so the challenges were set for 5th edition, which was spearheaded by a very small group of people. and who believed that, we could take elements from all the previous iterations of the game, the things, kind of exploring the DNA of the game and saying, what makes D&D D&D? Took a lot of introspection, and that's when the beginnings of D&D Next, which became 5e. John, do you want to?
Yeah, I guess this one is me. And, we wrote a book about this that is called Lore and Legends.
Lore and Legends.
That talks about the 5th edition in particular, how it came together. And some of the material you see here, this is from the very beginning of it, because we kind of go through, in as much detail as we could, how 5e came together.
And John, if I may, just before you, again, John, who's kind of cracked the code on this better than anyone I know. But before we get into this is kind of the coda here. So consider, we talked a little bit earlier about how D&D came mainstream, at least however you want to define mainstream. But remember, we're at a point here, it is 2012 right now. So the game's been around for about 40 years, just about, at that point. It's a dinosaur. It's a dusty tabletop game. In fact, it's almost a kind of a passive joke that people make about the 80s or the old days, right? Nostalgia. It is absolutely tied to this notion of being an old game that's probably bound for extinction. But, John, is that what happens over the last 10 years?
No. And, nobody would have seen this coming, right? In 2014, when the 5th edition began rolling out, people were not exactly expecting that this was going to suddenly take the world by storm again. And the question of why it does is really the question that motivated us to go and look at this. And, part of it, just speaking to some of the earliest work they did on it, the Iowa and Alpha playtests before D&D Next, which was this enormous, involving ultimately like 185,000 playtesters. I was one of them. I remember at the time I played at San Diego Comic-Con, that would kind of play versions of the system and give feedback on it. This process led to what they called an edition for all editions. They approached this from the perspective of, we're going to try to make a game that is recognizably D&D to everybody and has all the kind of cool stuff that people expect, but not like some of the crunchiness that we had trying to imitate MMOs in 4th edition. We'll keep a little bit of it because it's really cool if every class has some powers that they can do, which wasn't really a feature of the earliest incarnations of the game by any means. But, it worked, and the system became enormously popular.
So there was a number of reasons. We're going to go lightning round really through those reasons. And again, if you're really interested in reading about them, there's, as John said, a book called Lore and Legends that we're actually be signing afterwards if you're interested in learning more about that. And we have another book called Art and Arcana that covers kind of the rest, the first 45 years. But so going through real quick, there was a couple of key reasons about, I think, not why we're sitting here today. I suspect this group here would probably come no matter what, whether D&D had blown up the world over the last 10 years or not. But there's a lot of people out there that would care a lot less about D&D, and we wouldn't be talking about it so much today if some of these things hadn't happened, and if the people at Wizards of the Coast hadn't made some really, really good choices. Kyle, you want to start about the first one?
Well, one of the things is we experienced a phenomenon. What happened with D&D when it first came out in 1974 was a phenomenon. If it happened a few years earlier, without the influence of Tolkien and fantasy in the marketplace, it maybe wouldn't have taken off. And if it happened a few years later, with video games out there, maybe it wouldn't have succeeded. What happened in 2014, 2015, as this game started to blow up again, was a phenomenon. And you can't really put your finger on it. That's why what we tried to look at in the book is there a single thing that happened? It's really a confluence of things. It's Dungeons and Dragons was suddenly, again, being referenced on shows and talked about. And something like Stranger Things, you can't deny how important it was to see children playing this game and talking about these things, which triggered nostalgia in people. So you have things like that working hand in hand with a rule set that finally aligns with the true values of the game, where it's not trying to be something it isn't, but it's saying, you know what, we're going to be this. We're going to be a role-playing game, and we're going to pay respect to what came before. And it finally had this alignment. And those are two key things. I'll let you guys fill in some more.
Yeah, so again, they got into really lavish art. They had this rule set that was extremely well tested. I mean, you have to understand the level of testing that John was talking about. It was unheard of to bring in 175,000 people to test a role-playing game around that time. Before that, testing amounted to, well, something quite a bit less than that. So there was a lot of factors. And again, we're not going to go through each of them in painful detail. One thing that they did do, before I turn it over to John for, I think, what might be the most important, one thing they did is they reached out to a lot of people that have been playing the game for a while. And thematically, they tied into a lot of lore that was time-tested that people loved. Let's bring back that great vampire Strahd. Let's bring back a Serac. We all love a Serac if we've all died painfully in the Tomb of Horrors. Let's do that. Let's write a love letter to those that have been around for a while and invite them back into the fold. It was a lot of things like that seem subtle and they even seem small, but in aggregate made for a wildly popular game. But there's one thing that D&D since the beginning had not been able to solve, and we keyed on it a little bit earlier, was the idea that you almost always had to see the game played to get it, especially in the 70s, but really through the 80s, 90s. How well can you explain a role-playing game to your friends? John, what happens in 2015? Well, what happens around now?
I know. So it turns out there's this thing called the internet. And like the internet had obviously been a great place for the community to gather around D&D, a great way to distribute rules, all the D&D Next stuff I was referring to. You would download packets of it. There are like 10 or 12 individual playtest packets you would give feedback on and things like it. But once we have like YouTube and Twitch, suddenly you can watch people playing these games online and, you know, watch people who are actually quite good at playing characters and who are funny and good looking and like the kind of people that you wish you could be. And, you know, this really did crack that code that Mike was referring to, this difficulty of trying to figure out how to get people to understand really what you're supposed to do. Something that just opening up the book and reading it, if you don't already know kind of what an RPG is, that had always been a tremendous barrier to entry. And so, yes, people like Critical Role, or these days Dimension 20, Acquisitions Incorporated, which was, of course, kind of tied to Wizards from the beginning. And I really view as kind of the first one of these, right? Because they were doing this as podcasts as early as, I want to say, like 2008. And then doing live performances, which is something we now associate with all these groups as well, that you can fill stadiums with people who have come to see Critical Role. And yeah, the impact of this on just being able to show people, here's how you and your friends can get together around a table and tell the kind of story you want to tell. And this gets back to the point Kyle was making earlier about, you know, we all love games. I play a lot of AAA computer games, you know, like, but they lack that artisanal component of really the story, you know, in D&D around the tabletop only has to be a story that you and your friends sitting there are into. It's like you can customize it to be exactly what you want in a way it's real hard to get. Even with this new fangled AI stuff, I think it's still kind of hard to get out of a computer interface.
So at the very same time that we've got this great new edition with great new rules and great new art and familiar lore, and we've got actual play, we can now find out how the game works. And then something totally, another thing that happens outside the wall of Wizards of the Coast happens, is we start seeing this game show up in the strangest of places.
And this is what we're talking about, phenomenon. This is something that people sitting in a business meeting can't say, I know what will happen if we put the show, we mention D&D on these key shows, or we spend these marketing dollars. Something happened in the zeitgeist that translated the game to another level. And you see things like the Goldbergs and Stranger Things and Community, and they're all talking about Dungeons and Dragons. That coalescing with the demystification of the game all helped democratize it. Suddenly everyone's like, oh, I've been kind of playing D&D my whole life, or I'm into fantasy football. I guess that's not that different from fantasy this. You know, there's stats and wow, okay. So me in my personal life started seeing people that you never thought would want to play Dungeons and Dragons going like, hey man, I want to try. Can I get together and roll a character? And people are really open to it because they're like, you know what? This is very similar to stuff I'm already into. I watch Game of Thrones. I like Harry Potter. Oh, spells are cool. You know, there's the taboo had been stripped. And look, these iconic characters, there we are in was that French car commercial, finally getting into the live action world. Then there's this great nostalgia for the past, which was triggered largely by Stranger Things. Again, something that they didn't plan or control. And the other thing they were doing was releasing games and modules like events. It wasn't like, let's just put one out every week and overwhelm people. It was, let's put out 2 big things a year. Let's make it an event. Let's make the community talk about it. Let's turn this into like a movie release. And that type of change in philosophy really helped things too. That coupled with the lifestyle philosophy, which is saying, you know, we're not just a game brand. We are a lifestyle. And we're going to have D&D in your house 7 days a week, not just the night you play it. Which is also why we also wrote these crazy cookbooks called Heroes Feast, to add another dimension of immersion to the game, which is you're sitting at a table, 6 or 7 people, you're probably eating really bad food, and you're hanging out for 5 or 6 hours. It's like a dinner table. And so why not introduce fantasy-themed food? And so that's what we started to see happening over the past few years, is how can we expand the concepts of D&D beyond just a game?
So it's 2024. D&D has been around for 50 years. And I don't think anyone here or at this table would have ever believed it would be where it is today, especially after all the ups and downs. So with that, we'd love to take some questions. Storm, do we have till 50 or 45? I know we got a little bit of a late start. 45? Okay, we better go fast. Lightning round. Yes, you right there.
Records of Lotus Warrior. About the Japanese activities, not so much. I mean, again, those appeared, in magazines like Tactics, right, in Japan. There were a set of places where that all played out. They were eager to get into the Japanese market, but I don't think that was, I guess I'd put it this way too. They were already had Dragonlance and things like that by the time that activity was happening. And Forgotten Realms was already being baked by Ed Greenwood and starting to appear in Dragon issues. So, I mean, it was on a collision course, but that's parallel evolution. I don't think that there was influence. Well, I mean, I think you could argue you get some of that from the FR and Dragonlance stuff as well, right?
So lightning round here. We'll do 30-second responses. Gentleman in the blue shirt right there. Yes, and then you.
So this is a question about the OGL and the recent kerfuffle that followed. I mean, I guess... Oh, I think it was enormously important. Yeah, I mean, and again, Ryan Dancy and the people that were the primary architects of it were very insistent that, this was a way to take the oxygen down the room for every system other than the D20 system, right? They were profoundly successful at doing that. If you just look at the set of publishers that ended up adopting it.
My older brothers and sisters were into it, especially my brothers. So I would hang out like Elliot and E.T. and watch them play and draw and learn that. There was no taboo or stigma. I don't know. I was in a big family, but we played it. Like I'd go visit them at Boy Scout camp, and everyone at Boy Scout camp in the 80s was playing D&D or an Indiana Jones version homebrew or whatever it was. So it was just there, and there wasn't that stigma that some people experienced. So thankfully, that and Marvel Comics were like a big influence on how I learned how to draw.
My parents threw away all my books for all those reasons. My mom did in particular. And in fact, I was so terrified at one point that I would not look into the eyes of the what they call the Orange Spine Dungeon Master Guide, which has got this image of this guy doing this, and I wouldn't look in the eyes of the books. I was afraid I'd get possessed. So
there was a nice thong. Also, If people come buy books, the first 5 people I'm giving away free bags of coffee.
Booth 602, before we lose you, booth 602, we're going to go right after to sign books if you're interested. We had a question over here, then there, then we'll have, yes, you, and then you.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear. What? It was $10. Of course, that didn't include dice, and it didn't include the supplements. And 20 grand, 25?
Yeah, they're high priced.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. Aero Lotus. And I mean, Desert. To me, it doesn't matter. Actually, it really doesn't. I would do any of them. I think they all do the job.
Only one? Okay. Aero Lotus, Dave Trampier, Tony DiTerlizzi, Jeff Easley, Larry Elmore. Sorry, did you say one? Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
I would say Lotus. I think he's like the El Greco of D&D fantasy art. I love him. And 5th edition's pretty great. I like them all, but 5th edition's easy because I can teach people and to play with me, and that's key.
And if any of you are from SF, I'll be on stage with Errol there at Green Apple Books on Monday. So.
I think that is all the time. Is there one more question? We can take one more, or we are good to go. Okay, one more. Make it fast, please.
So here's what it is. You got this amazing movie, and they decided to move it 3 weeks right up against Super Mario movie. The dumbest move you can possibly do, a game movie versus a game movie. They had a clear shot at March, and I think the people that made the movie and released the movie know that they had a great movie. I think it won a Hugo. It won a lot of awards, probably Rotten Tomatoes top fantasy movie of the year. It made its money back. I think it broke even, and they know that they have something successful there. They had some good chemistry. So it's more of a marketing mistake than it was the quality of the movie. So I think they know that, and hopefully we get more, because it was a very fun movie.
Please come see us at booth 602 if you have any more questions. Thank you so much, everybody. We really appreciate the time.
Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe, and here are a few more videos for you to check out.